So, my name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and I have an interest in the mental health of doctors. I work in private practice in Harley Street, just a 5-minute walk from here, and I see quite a few doctors in my private practice. There are, of course, NHS health practitioner programs where doctors can go and see psychiatrists and clinicians in the NHS, but I offer a service where if people want to come and see someone privately, and it is said, though I'm not sure it's true or not, that I may see in Harley Street anyway more doctors working as a psychiatrist than perhaps any other practitioner there. My interest in the mental health of doctors, and I now lecture a bit at the University of Buckingham when we're thinking about building resilience into medical students, I want to talk a bit about that, dates back twofold. I remember an hour-long sweat-drenched drive to the Bethlehem Royal Hospital where I was starting off my training as a junior doctor in psychiatry. Day one, I didn't really know any psychiatry, and I was very nervous about having to see patients for the first time. This is way back in 1988, 1989, long before people looked after junior doctors and you had induction. You were just thrown in at the deep end in those days. So it was an hour-long drive of me ruminating about what to say or what to do with the very first patient. I turned up on the ward, and I don't know whether nurses did this on purpose because they were being wicked or nasty, but I didn't know, obviously, any of the patients on the ward. It was my very first day. I hadn't done any psychiatry at all. Just so happened, one of the patients was a psychiatrist. And who did they give me to see, first of all? The psychiatrist. So I'm interviewing the psychiatrist for about 10 minutes, and I, being all over the place a bit, I didn't do an occupational history or anything, didn't figure out what they did for a living. And about 10 minutes into my interview, the psychiatrist, patient, stopped me and said, "Excuse me, how long have you been doing this for?" Which obviously indicated I wasn't doing very well. So I looked at my watch, I said, about 10 minutes. And after that, at the Bethlehem, I became a senior registrar there. Joe Connolly, a consultant there, ran a thing for a short time called the Sick Healthcare Professionals Unit. Fell ill temporarily, and they asked me to act up. So I became a kind of locum temporary consultant running this inpatient unit, which was devoted to sick healthcare professionals. And by and large, the vast majority of the people on the ward were doctors. There was an outpatient service as well. The service only ran for a short while because there was a problem over getting payment through the tertiary referral system. But I remember vividly, because it was an unusual unit, it's an unusual unit in the NHS to have a psychiatric unit with nothing but doctors as patients, that unfortunately sometimes some patients would get so unwell, they would require a Mental Health Act assessment. And we would contact the social worker who would turn up on the ward, not being very clear about what kind of special ward this was, and would announce to the doctor that I had informed the social worker we needed to do a Mental Health Act assessment and think about sectioning them under the Mental Health Act, that I had indeed asked for a Mental Health Act assessment. And I don't know why it was, and apologies to any GPs here, but GPs in particular who were on the ward seemed to get very angry whenever I instituted a Mental Health Act assessment on them, more than any other specialist. And they would get furious, and they would say to the social worker, "It's outrageous that Dr. Persaud wants to section me. It's outrageous. It's just ridiculous. In fact, as I think about it, I'll section him." And they'd grab the pink forms from the social worker and start scribbling, filling them out. And again, no disrespect to any social workers here. Sometimes their grip on what's going on isn't entirely firm. I would often get a phone call from the social worker saying, I'm sorry, I'm very confused. I thought I was here to section so-and-so, but it turns out I'm here to section you." And it would get very complicated. Okay. Yeah, so I have a long-standing interest in the mental health of doctors, and I have a couple of apologies before I launch into my main theme, which is that, first of all, I'm suffering from a bit of a cold, so I hope my voice lasts for the 20 minutes. But apology number 2 is I am fully aware that a lot of what I'm going to say is going to irritate the hell out of large numbers of you, and I apologize profusely for the fact this is going to be very, very irritating, frankly annoying. At least, though, in apologizing to you before I go and do the bad thing of annoying you, I have demonstrated that I have insight, and surely that's the important thing. And also I comfort myself with the idea at least an irritated audience is an awake audience. So we need to build resilience into medical students, and I'm going to focus, because it's a big subject, on just one narrow element of the stress that doctors face, and that is the stress of conflict. doctors engage in a lot of conflict with patients, other doctors, and their employers. And I want to focus in particular on one element of the conflict that seems to cause a lot of stress. And it's a very strange idea I'm going to hit you with, and I think a lot of the conflict goes to the heart of a problem of identity. That the National Health Service or the employers of doctors have not been clear with themselves, or doctors, and doctors aren't being clear with themselves, about whether doctors are employees or professionals. And these are two different things. And one of the reasons for the confusion is the NHS has many employees, and certainly it has some professionals, but there are many very strong forces at work trying to force doctors away from the idea they are professionals and into the idea they are employees. And I believe that that's leading to a lot of conflict. And that's been my clinical experience of seeing doctors who come to see me. So what is an employee as opposed to a professional? An employee has a contractual arrangement with the employer whereby there is a circumscribed sense in which the employer has a claim on the employee's time, and that will be in the contract. So after 5 p.m, when you're free to go home, everyone understands, employer and employee, there is no claim on the employee's time. Their job has finished. They've done their job is over, they are no longer required by the employer. So the notion of a circumscribed contractual arrangement, a point at which the arrangement or the contractual obligation ends, is central to the notion of being an employee. And also central to the notion is the idea that the employee's fundamental allegiance while doing the job will be to the employer, and everyone understands that. What is a professional, which is what I want to argue doctors should really be? Instead, a professional is someone, and this goes to a very, very key issue, is someone who is different to an employee because it's part of their identity. Being a doctor is not something that you do, it is something that you are. There is a socialization process, in my view, which is one of the reasons why medical school training takes so long. We are transforming the identity of medical students from one thing to another thing. And the core identity is at the heart of the notion of what a professional is. A doctor is someone different as an individual compared to what they were when they first entered medical school, when they're a member of the lay public. A professional has two key allegiances. The allegiance is to the patient and do the best of the patient at all times, and the other allegiance is to the skill, the science, the art of the practice of that profession. Here comes the bad news. There is no allegiance to an employer written into that arrangement. The professional's primary allegiance, let me repeat the point, is to the patient and to the science. And that inevitably, in my opinion, leads to conflict with employers. And that is the source of a lot of stress that doctors have, and they haven't resolved in their heads. Am I an employee or am I an independent autonomous professional? And part of the training, if we're going to build resilience into medical students, is a sense in which they think about how to handle that inevitable conflict. And the institutions need to think about how they handle that conflict. In my opinion, patients want to see doctors who are professionals as opposed to doctors who are employees. And again, we're going to have maybe a debate about that when we discuss it. I'm going to illuminate the point by using an example of something that happened to me when I was flying on a plane and there was a medical emergency. But if you think about this, you're sunning yourself, you're on holiday as a doctor, you finally managed to take a break from the stressful job, you're on some glamorous part of the tropics, the Caribbean, you're sunning yourself by the pool, you discover rather disturbingly that NHS manager, who has been the bane of your life, unfortunately did come on the same package holiday and is sunning themselves just 20 yards away. I want you to imagine the scene, the hotel manager that you remember when you checked in rushes up and you think, oh my God, they're coming to see me, something's happened. And they pass you by, they run over to the NHS manager, and they lean in and whisper in their ear, but you can overhear the whisper. And the hotel manager says, I'm terribly sorry about this. I'm really sorry to disturb your holiday. We have a management emergency, and we wondered if you could help us out. It's not going to happen, okay? Because the NHS manager is an employee. However, it is quite possible that someone at that hotel will come up to you and ask you to look after someone who's fallen ill, even though you're on holiday. As a professional, there is no circumscribed boundary being drawn around the idea that you're on holiday and therefore have no obligation. I repeat the point. Being a doctor is something that you are. It's something to do with your identity. You don't stop being a doctor when you're on holiday. When doctors retire, you see often they keep up with their CPD, they keep up with their registration. Even though they've retired, they continue being doctors. So, we're on a plane, my wife and I, and my wife's a professor of eye surgery. As my parents like to say, whenever we're introduced at public functions, she is a proper doctor. We're on a plane, flying from Goa on holiday back to Heathrow, and we have that tannoy call that every doctor doesn't want to hear. Is there a doctor on board? My wife, being my wife, immediately reaches for the button to indicate that we are doctors. And I grab her hand and I say, just hang on a second, let's think this through. Again, a bit of racism coming up. I said, there's a bunch of Indians back there. There must be a doctor among them. Let's keep quiet. Let them deal with it. My wife, being my wife, I don't know how come wives always seem to join a club, a secret club, ignored me and pressed the button. And as luck would have it, we're the only two doctors on board the plane. In the cabin we go to, there is a very sick-looking woman who's unconscious, very elderly, lying on the floor, looking very ill indeed. And my wife immediately springs into action, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but you will discover this if this does ever happen to you. I don't want it to happen to you. Planes carry an enormous amount of medical equipment. A lot of drugs, there was a defib pack. We had her wired up to a defib ECG thing so we could see her trace, and she was bradycardic, and she was not looking in great shape at all. My wife, put a drip in and was in action, and then in order to give me something to do, I had a sense that I was getting in the way a bit. She said, why don't you look in her handbag and see if you can get any medical history? So I was pleased to be given something to do. This is my area, psychiatry, communication. So I got into the handbag, found the woman's passport, opened the passport, the photograph page, and the photograph of the woman in the passport looked like she was in her early 30s. The woman looked like she was in her late 70s. So I said, I have no idea what the disease is, but I can tell you something. It has ravaged this woman's body. It has ravaged this woman's body, I said with great flourish. And then the woman standing next to me grabbed the passport and said, that's my passport. So I hadn't even done that right. Anyway, the pilot comes back to us and says, what's happening? We said she's very ill. He said, okay, so you're going to have to keep her going till Gatwick. Gatwick was like 6 hours away. And we said, no, you don't understand. She's very ill. We have to divert and land. I only realized this afterwards, after subsequent events, that actually airlines do not want to divert and land. It's very expensive for them, and they will dig their heels in and do their best to avoid that. So the pilot, who now is something very important, is acting as an employee. He is behaving perfectly legitimately, in my opinion, in terms of looking after the employer's interests. He told us what the form was. He said the form is, we call a doctor in Gatwick, they make the decision. Okay? Now, this is the bit where my wife gave me a significant look. She knows this is the bit that if I'm good at anything, it's the handling the conflict. So I said to the pilot, and remember he had a massive disadvantage. What he should have done was take us into the cockpit, away from the 100 passengers standing on their chairs looking on. That was the first mistake he made. I said to the pilot, so you're going to get an opinion from a doctor in Gatwick as opposed to you're going to ignore the opinion of the doctors here on the scene who are telling you to divert. And I need to tell you something. I don't know how many coroner's inquests you've been to, but if anything happens to this woman and the coroner turns to you and says, why did you ignore the advice of the two doctors who are on the scene? I'd like to know what you're going to say. There was a pause and he said, I think we'll divert to Bahrain. So, important point there, how to handle conflict, how to get your way as an independent professional. We were behaving as professionals. I'm not saying we're being any more heroic as any other doctor, but we were looking after the interests of the unconscious patient on the ground. We diverted to Bahrain. We arrived, they opened the emergency exits, the Middle Eastern sun sprayed in, because it was very bright and hot, and the woman had been resolutely unconscious throughout this whole journey. The emergency services arrived, they clambered onto the aircraft. As they arrive on the aircraft, just our luck, the woman wakes up. And you could see all the other passengers thinking, what were these bozos doing? Here the proper doctors have arrived. And as they got on a stretcher, as they're stretchering her out the aircraft through the emergency exit, she suddenly had a real bout of vigor, and she kind of sat up and put her hands out like this and stopped the stretcher going out the door. And there was a bit of a struggle while she was doing this. And they were doing this for quite a while before I said to her, being the psychiatrist, I said, "So what's the problem? What's up?" She said, "I'm not leaving without my cigarettes," which may have been why she was in such trouble. We got back up in the air again, and about 4 hours later, I said to my wife, "I have a horrible feeling we're descending again." And she said, "Don't be ridiculous, we're still over Germany." And of course, the pilot, who I think had been on some kind of Breaking Bad news course, explained in a sorrowful voice that because of the diversion to Bahrain, everyone immediately looked at us. We have violated European conventional rules, whatever, about how long a flight crew can stay on a craft and be there. So we have to land in Cologne and change flight crew. And that was another 4-hour delay thrown into our flight. So by the time we get to Gatwick, we're like 10 hours, 12 hours late. And very interestingly, no other passenger came up and complained to us. Because you know what? If you're lying unconscious on the ground in an aircraft, you want some doctor in that plane to fight your corner. You want an independent professional, I want to argue, to be fighting your corner. But we got into conflict with the employer. If that pilot was the chief executive of an NHS trust, if we torture my analogy, sure, they'd have diverted the first time, but you know what? They don't want you on their plane again because you're a troublemaker. You're someone who's going to be painful and get in the way, and what happens to a lot of doctors who get in the way and are troublemakers and are behaving as true professionals as opposed to employees is they get eliminated by trusts these days, in my opinion.